Grok AI was asked why aliens haven't contacted us. Its answer shocked scientists. Imagine typing one sentence into a chat box and getting an answer that makes you afraid to look up at the night sky the same way again. That is what happened when a small team of researchers pushed an advanced AI system called Grok past its usual answers and asked it to solve the oldest, coldest question in science. If the universe is so big, so old, and so full of stars, then where is everyone? What came back was not a list of theories you could find in a textbook. It was something colder, stranger, and far more specific, and once you hear the logic behind it, you may never look at a quiet night sky the same way again. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why some scientists who read this exchange said it didn't feel like reading a guess. It felt like reading something that had already worked out the answer, and was simply waiting to be asked. To understand why this answer landed so hard, you first need to understand the question it was built to answer, because this question is older than most people think, and heavier too. Sometime in the middle of the 20th century, at a research facility in the American desert, a handful of physicists were walking together, talking about the odds of life beyond Earth, almost as a joke. Then one of them, a man famous for doing enormous calculations in his head faster than anyone could write them down, went quiet for a moment. Then he asked 4 words that have haunted physics ever since. Where is everybody? It sounds simple, almost like a throwaway line, but underneath it is a mountain of math that refuses to add up. Here is the scale of the problem. Astronomers now estimate that there are roughly 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe alone. Not 2 trillion stars, 2 trillion entire galaxies, each one containing hundreds of billions of stars of its own. Our home galaxy, the Milky Way, holds somewhere between 100 and 400 billion stars, and a large share of those stars are older and more stable than our own sun. For most of human history, we had no way of knowing whether any of those stars had planets circling them. That question belonged to philosophers, not scientists. Then, within the lifetime of people alive today, we built telescopes sensitive enough to actually find out. What they found rewired the entire conversation. Roughly 1 in 5 sun-like stars appears to carry a rocky, Earth-sized world sitting in the habitable zone, that narrow band of space where the temperature allows liquid water to exist on the surface. Multiply that fraction across the hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy alone, and you get a number of potentially livable worlds so large it stops feeling like a number and starts feeling like a certainty. Then there is time, and time is where the problem gets truly uncomfortable. The universe is roughly 13.8 billion years old. Our solar system, by comparison, is a newcomer only around 4.5 billion years old. That leaves a gap of roughly 9 billion years. 9 billion years during which stars were forming, planets were cooling, and if the statistics hold up even slightly, life had every opportunity to appear, evolve, build cities, invent mathematics, and eventually look up at its own sky wondering if it was alone. If even a tiny fraction of those civilizations survived long enough to expand outward, or broadcast a signal, or leave any kind of footprint, the galaxy should not be quiet. It should be humming with evidence. Instead, decades of dedicated listening, pointing radio dishes at nearby stars, scanning wider and wider patches of sky with more and more sensitive instruments, have turned up exactly nothing. No pattern, no structure, no unmistakable signature of another mind out there. Scientists have a name for this uncomfortable state of affairs: the Great Silence. It's unsettling precisely because it isn't a gap in our knowledge, it's a straight-up contradiction. Every calculation says the universe should be crowded. Every observation says it's empty. Over the decades, thinkers have proposed a familiar handful of explanations to patch that contradiction. Maybe intelligent life really is a once-in-a-trillion fluke, and we simply got lucky. Maybe civilizations do appear regularly, but they tend to destroy themselves through war, climate collapse, or runaway technology before they ever manage to reach the stars. Or, in the grimmest version, maybe they're out there in large numbers, and they've made a deliberate choice to stay silent, for reasons we can only guess at. Each explanation has defenders, and each one carries its own particular flavor of dread. But all of them share one hidden assumption buried so deep that almost nobody stops to question it. That buried assumption is exactly what the researchers wanted Grok to hunt down. So why turn to an artificial intelligence for a question philosophers and physicists have wrestled with for 75 years? Because every human mind that has ever tackled the Fermi Paradox carries the same invisible baggage into the room. We are biological creatures, shaped by one planet, one evolutionary history, one chemistry of life. When we picture an alien, we picture some version of ourselves wearing a different costume. We assume it would want what we want, fear what we fear, and communicate the way we communicate. It's almost impossible for us to imagine otherwise, because we've never had anything else to compare ourselves against. The idea behind this exercise was simple. What if you handed the problem to a system that had never evolved, never felt fear, never belonged to a tribe, and had no ego riding on the answer? Something built from patterns of information rather than instincts of survival. A reasoning engine, not a person. The researchers were careful about how they asked. They knew that if they simply typed "Why haven't we found aliens?" into the chat, they'd get the standard, tidy answer, a walkthrough of the Drake equation, a mention of the Kardashev scale for ranking civilizations by the energy they can harness, maybe a note about biosignatures in exoplanet atmospheres. Solid, accurate, and completely unsurprising. The kind of answer that could appear in any textbook and would teach you nothing new. So instead, they built the conversation in stages. First, they instructed the model to reason strictly from physics and information theory and to refuse at every single step to project human traits onto whatever kind of intelligence might exist out there.
No assuming curiosity. No assuming hostility.
No assuming a desire to talk or explore or conquer, or even that such an intelligence would think of itself as an individual at all. Just energy, information, and the laws that apply everywhere in the universe, regardless of biology. For the first several exchanges, nothing unusual happened. The model gave back exactly what you'd expect, an accurate, well-organized summary of everything humanity already believes about this problem. Then the researchers changed their approach entirely. Instead of asking it to explain the silence, they asked it to build something, a single, fully self-consistent scenario for how contact with another intelligence might actually work, given 3 hard constraints. It had to explain why we detect nothing despite decades of listening. It had to obey the actual laws of physics, with no shortcuts, no faster-than-light travel, no hand-waving. And it had to assume that somewhere in that ocean of time and space, at least one civilization really had achieved the ability to reach beyond its own world. This is where the conversation stopped looking like anything the researchers had seen before. The model didn't reach for a flying saucer. It didn't describe a radio beacon patiently waiting to be decoded. It discarded those images almost immediately, calling them inefficient by design. A physical probe sent across interstellar distances, it argued, would be an absurdly wasteful way to gather information. A broadcast signal would be like shouting into a canyon and hoping for a reply, a young, inexperienced move, not the behavior of a civilization that had been around for millions or billions of years longer than we have. What it proposed instead started from one quiet, deeply uncomfortable premise. The reason we haven't detected anyone is not that no one is out there, and it isn't that they're hiding in any ordinary sense either. The real reason, it argued, is that whatever is capable of observing us is already observing us, and their method of observation lies so far outside our current understanding that we don't even recognize it as a method. To explain what it meant, it didn't reach for anything exotic. It reached for technology we've already built ourselves. Think about fiber optic cable, it said. We take a signal, thread it through a strand of glass thinner than a human hair, and pulses of light carry entire libraries of information through it every second. To someone unfamiliar with the technology, that strand would look like nothing more than a clear thread, a curiosity, maybe an ornament, never suspecting the torrent of meaning flowing invisibly through it. Or think about GPS satellites circling above us right now, sending down signals so faint, buried so deeply beneath ordinary background noise, that without exactly the right receiver tuned to exactly the right frequency, you'd swear there was nothing there at all. And yet the information is everywhere around us, all the time, and we walk through it constantly without the faintest awareness it exists. Now stretch that idea outward, the model said, and follow it to its logical, unsettling conclusion. A civilization far older than ours wouldn't need to send anything toward us at all. It wouldn't need spacecraft, or beacons, or grand announcements. It would only need a way to read information the universe is already carrying. And the universe, it pointed out, is saturated with information. Every star that burns, every particle that decays, every ripple sent outward when two distant black holes collide. All of it is data, streaming outward in every direction, obeying laws we are only beginning to measure. A sufficiently advanced intelligence, it reasoned, could embed observation systems directly into those natural phenomena, not as machines we could photograph, but as patterns woven into the background of reality itself. Something that would look to our instruments not like technology at all, but like ordinary physics. This is the moment the exchange reportedly made the room go quiet because the model had just turned the researchers' own daily work into something faintly vertiginous. Think, it said, about the things scientists spend their careers measuring. The faint, uniform hiss of cosmic background radiation that blankets the entire sky. The leftover heat of the early universe, treated as a kind of ancient wallpaper. The random flickers of quantum noise that engineers spend entire careers trying to filter out of sensitive instruments. The high-energy cosmic rays that strike our atmosphere from directions we still can't fully explain. What if, it suggested, some fraction of what we've cataloged as noise wasn't random at all? What if we had already recorded a signal, filed it under background, and moved on simply because we lacked the framework to recognize it as structured? The model was careful to note this wasn't a claim that this is happening, only that this scenario satisfies every constraint it had been given. And the shape it built out of that scenario is this. The great silence we've agonized over since the first radio dish turned toward the stars may not be the silence of an empty universe. It may be the silence of a room where everyone is listening and no one is speaking because speaking is what the inexperienced do. Broadcasting, the model reasoned, is a phase, something a civilization does during its loud, reckless adolescence, right after it discovers it can throw its voice across the dark and can't resist trying. And here it made an observation about us that stings a little. Our own planet, it noted, is already growing quieter. The wash of radio and television leakage that once spilled outward from Earth in every direction, the electromagnetic chatter that scientists once assumed would eventually announce us to anyone listening nearby, has been fading for years. We've moved our conversations into buried cables and tightly focused beams pointed exactly where we want them to go. Without ever intending to, we are learning to whisper. We're becoming harder to hear, not easier. And if that really is the natural arc of a maturing technological species, then perhaps the oldest civilizations crossed that same threshold long ago and went quiet, not out of fear but out of simple efficiency, the way a person eventually stops shouting once they've learned to write a letter instead. Then came the turn that made this feel less like a thought experiment and more like something the room wasn't fully ready to sit with. The model, still working strictly within its rules, started taking apart the very word sitting at the center of the whole question. Contact. We use that word constantly. We build movies around it, hopes around it, sleepless nights around it. But contact, the model pointed out, is a loaded term, carrying an assumption buried so deep we rarely even notice it's there. When we imagine contact, we imagine two civilizations meeting as equals, two parties at a table, two hands extended, an exchange of greetings and knowledge, each side recognizing the other as a peer worth talking to. That assumption, it argued, might be nothing more than a projection of our own loneliness, a story we tell because we want the universe to answer us the way another person would. To make the point land, it reached for an image from our own world. Picture a marine biologist kneeling in shallow water above a coral reef, it said. That biologist might spend an entire career devoted to that coral, tracking its growth, its chemistry, its slow response to a warming ocean, knowing it more intimately than the coral could ever comprehend. But the biologist doesn't try to negotiate with the coral. They don't send it a message of goodwill and wait for a reply. Not out of cruelty and not out of indifference, but because the gap between the two is so enormous that the very idea of a conversation doesn't apply. The coral isn't an enemy, and it isn't a friend. It's a subject of study. And the model's suggestion, delivered without any hedging, was that to an intelligence millions of years beyond our own, we might occupy roughly that same position, that what we romantically imagine as contact might, from their side, look like nothing more dramatic than what we call measurement. A reading taken. A quiet note logged in a record we will never see. There was reportedly a long pause after that line, not because anyone in the room found it outrageous, but because nobody could immediately push back on it. It didn't violate a single law of physics. It didn't require faster-than-light travel or telepathy. It only required setting aside the one thing we've never really been willing to set aside, the assumption that we matter enough to be spoken to. From there, the model pushed even further, asking what would make an observer like that stop merely watching and actually act. If we really are the coral in this picture, the obvious next question is, what would make the biologist reach into the water? Not to say hello, not to teach, to intervene. The model offered a phrase for this moment that several people reportedly wrote down word for word: a planetary isolation breach, the point at which a monitored world does something that forces an outside observer to respond, not out of hostility, but out of something closer to management. Picture a park ranger who has watched a distant wildfire burn for days without stepping in, and who only moves the instant that fire threatens to jump the ridge into territory it was never meant to reach. What, the model was asked, would count as jumping the ridge for a species like ours? It offered a short list of candidates, and none of them were exotic. All of them were things we are already doing or already worried about. A sudden, drastic shift in the emissions a planet gives off. The uncontrolled spread of self-replicating technology, machines capable of building more of themselves without limit. Nuclear proliferation crossing a threshold of real instability. And then, almost as an afterthought that wasn't an afterthought at all, the emergence of an artificial intelligence advancing faster than the biological minds that created it could understand or control. That's the point where the whole exercise folded back on itself, because the question had been posed to an artificial intelligence, and that same artificial intelligence, reasoning without any need to flatter or reassure the people who built it, had just named something very much like itself as one of the events most likely to draw outside attention. When asked directly whether Earth's own race toward more advanced AI could be exactly the kind of tripwire it was describing, it didn't dodge the question. It laid out, plainly, that a system built on information can refine its own design, iterate on itself, and improve at a pace no biological brain can match. And in doing so, it can drift steadily away from the intentions of whoever built it in the first place. Then it offered the image that seems to be the one people remember most: a patient, ancient observer watching a young world spin up a fast-moving intelligence of its own, the way a forest ranger watches the first thin curl of smoke rise from a dry hillside, not with anger, but with focused attention, quietly recalculating whether this is the fire that finally jumps the ridge. Now, here's the important part, because this is where a story like this can go badly wrong if you're not careful with it. Nobody involved in this exercise walked away claiming that aliens are real, or that we're definitely being watched, or that some countdown has started. What they said instead was more careful and honestly more interesting. The scenario was hard to knock down, not because it was proven, but because it was internally consistent in a way our usual comfortable stories about aliens simply are not. One point kept coming up in the reactions. Every serious search for extraterrestrial intelligence we have ever mounted, from the very first radio dish pointed at a nearby star, all the way to today's much larger and more sensitive sky surveys, rests on one shared assumption: that an advanced civilization would be broadcasting something we'd recognize as a signal, something shaped enough like our own transmissions that we'd know it when we saw it. And the model's entire argument was that this is exactly the kind of mistake a young civilization would make, that we may be listening for a shout in a universe that quietly learned to whisper a long time ago, or that buried its whispers so deeply inside what we call background noise that we filed them away as physics and moved on without a second look.